Cut auxiliary guidance and reroute emergency tracking, now. The command cracked through the orbital operations deck with enough force to freeze half the bridge crew mid-magnet. Colonel Dorian Wraith didn't raise his voice often, but when he did, officers obeyed without thought. 2 screens blinked out in rapid succession, the remaining heads-up displays glitching erratically, as if fighting against something far more intelligent than interference. No satellite relays, no signal returns. It's a coordinated cascade failure, said Lieutenant Merrick from the diagnostics console, knuckles white against the edge of the panel. It's not just orbital. Ground comms are disintegrating. The entire hemisphere below them had gone dark. No lights from cities, no civilian air traffic, no beacon pings. Earth wasn't sleeping. It was being silenced. Wraith's jaw tightened as he leaned closer to the central display, watching as patches of static consumed the last functioning bands over the Atlantic perimeter. A blue arc swept across the tactical map. No source, no frequency match. Just an effect. And then the sensor array collapsed into static. "Raise stations, full lockdown protocol," he ordered, barely turning his head. "If you're not wearing emergency seals in 10 seconds, you won't need them after." There were no screams. These were trained military analysts, strategists, flight coordinators. But even discipline has limits. The moment a kilometer-long object emerged into low orbit, unannounced, unchallenged, unwelcome, every screen on the command deck flickered to a single message. "You belong to the Dominion." "Dominion?" someone whispered near the communications trench. Wraith didn't answer. He knew that name. Every classified dossier Earth intelligence buried under interstellar anomalies had warned about it. The Kiro were not an empire. They were an eradication protocol disguised as one. The fact that they had chosen Earth next meant negotiations had never been on the table. Outside the windowed observation arch, the Earth's curvature dimmed as shadows swallowed sunlight. It wasn't atmospheric shift. The Curel vessel had positioned itself between Earth and its star, blocking enough light to cast half the globe into premature night. And then the first impact hit. A violet flash lit the Pacific horizon. 4 seconds later, orbital sensors translated the event as an antimatter dispersion blast. The Pacific Fleet had been vaporized without a single return volley. Wraith didn't need telemetry confirmation. The heads-up display showed only empty sea. "Tokyo," Marik choked out, watching another marker vanish. "There's no heat trail, they're skipping impact stages, just targeting and erasing." "Emergency override, full atmospheric withdrawal," Wraith ordered. "Get the rest of our platforms off planet before we lose command integrity." "We've already lost it," came the reply from Tactical Officer Breen. Her hand hovered near the manual relay trigger, but she didn't activate it. Her screen showed 14 more incoming vessels, staggered across 3 hemispheres. The orbital station shuddered, but not from impact. This was pressure. A field effect. Gravitational manipulation stretching the hull until it groaned beneath containment stress. External plating began to separate along the dorsal edge. Half a second later, warning klaxons kicked in. Wraith reached down, grabbed his helmet, and locked it in place. The synthetic visor engaged, adjusting for blackout conditions as cabin lighting failed. The second blast struck without warning. This time the impact was real. Direct contact along the primary docking array. G-forces punched Wraith against the bulkhead rail. An ensign was thrown across the deck, crashing into a substation. Sparks erupted from a blown panel, briefly illuminating the twisted remains of the communications tower outside. The structural integrity field buckled. Sections of the deck above peeled away, venting oxygen and debris. Wraith's helmet adjusted its internal air feed, while his HUD mapped the rapidly deteriorating environment. 2 bodies were pulled into the vacuum before the fallback seal dropped. He moved fast, boots magnetizing with each step as he crossed the ruined command pit. There was no panic. There was no time for it. The Corel weren't trying to win a war. They were rewriting the conditions of one. Earth had no frame of reference for this kind of conflict. They hadn't fought interstellar conquest. They'd written essays about it, drafted budgets for it, but never felt it. Not until now. Wraith pulled Breen up from the floor, her left arm hanging limp, suit torn at the shoulder. "Evac Pod 3, he said, hauling her toward the corridor. "No comms, no telemetry. Manual ejection." "Colonel, that's a direct vector. If they see launch heat." "They're not targeting pods," he interrupted. "They're targeting infrastructure. They think we're irrelevant." Breen didn't argue. That was what made her useful. The evacuation corridor was filled with faint drifting particles, dust, blood, fragments of broken rails. Wraith hit the pod lock, slid her inside, and set the ejection timer manually. She reached forward as the hatch began to close, her expression unreadable through the fractured faceplate. "I'll mark your location," she said, "if I make it down." "Don't. If they triangulate, you'll lead them straight to whatever's left." The pod launched with a low vibration. No explosion, no trail, just a smooth disappearance into Earth's atmosphere. Wraith stayed behind. He turned back toward the access shaft leading deeper into the compromised station. With the central command structure gone and the orbital network failing, he needed ground-level assessment, visual confirmation, real environments. Every step forward meant descending into a corridor with fewer lights, less gravity stabilization, and rising thermal damage indicators. Wraith wasn't walking into safety. He was walking into collapse. By the time he reached the auxiliary bay, the forward hull had ruptured completely. Through the shattered viewport, Earth glowed softly beneath him. It should have felt reassuring, but it didn't. The colors weren't right. Too much smoke across the eastern seaboard. Too many patterns that didn't match anything natural. When the escape shuttle fired, its launch vector skirted along the edge of an orbital shell fragment. A glancing hit, not enough to destroy it, but enough to send the pod spinning into atmospheric descent. Wraith stayed conscious through the burn, not because of training, but because of instinct. He had never fought a war where the first move erased your command structure, nullified your communications, and sent a single message to an entire species. He didn't expect to land, but when he did, crashing hard into a frozen valley near what had once been Anchorage, he crawled out of the wreckage, ribs cracked, oxygen low, visor half-fogged from internal damage. Snow fell silently around him, but even the weather didn't feel like his world anymore. In the distant sky, dark shapes continued to descend, eclipsing constellations one after another. A Dominion cleansing fleet, unopposed, methodical, inhumanly thorough. He didn't fall to his knees. He didn't scream. Instead, he dragged himself toward a half-buried outpost marked for decommissioning 5 years ago and keyed in the backup access code. Cold metal slid open. No lights inside, no noise, just shadow and waiting silence. Colonel Dorian Wraith stepped inside. The war hadn't started. It had already moved on without him. By the time Earth's remaining satellites blinked back online, reprogrammed, repurposed, rebranded, the war was no longer discussed in military terms. There were no more broadcasts from the United Nations, no national addresses, no announcements of surrender. The Corel Dominion had simply assumed control and erased the concept of resistance from official language. Colonel Dorian Wraith stepped out of the forgotten Anchorage outpost 5 days after the crash, his ribs tightly wrapped beneath scavenged thermal gear, his gait uneven but deliberate. The ice field had thawed unnaturally, the melt patterns geometrically precise. Corel climate stabilizers now floated in the upper stratosphere, adjusting global temperatures in real time to suppress weather that could disrupt city control grids. Anchorage had changed. The skyline had been stripped to uniform arcs, surveillance pylons mounted at every intersection. Civilian transports floated along fixed routes. Nobody looked up. Nobody waved. Pedestrians walked in clean lines, faces blank, expressions dulled. Emotion wasn't banned. It had been made unnecessary. Dominion enforcement units rotate every 28 hours. You've got a 90-minute window where patrols overlap, said Tyven, a former municipal systems analyst, now Wraith's contact inside the Anchorage Compliance Corps. He hadn't been chosen for his military skill. He could barely hold eye contact. but his knowledge of grid redundancies was invaluable. The bunker has 4 viable access tunnels. Most are blocked. One connects to the old telecom subnetwork. We can use that. Can you secure transit nodes without setting off spatial markers? Wraith asked, scanning the terminal's reallocation schedule through a salvaged wrist display. Only if we avoid power draws, no signals, no pressure spikes. Everything has to feel abandoned. Then we make it look dead. While the world watched sanctioned entertainment feeds, hour-long nature loops and sterilized orchestra rotations, Wraith's network scavenged culture. Not weapons, not munitions. Culture. Thousands of archived files, forgotten songs, banned artwork, banned languages, anything that evoked emotional reaction. The Kirel didn't censor directly, they replaced. Emotion was an inefficiency, content was flattened into informational value, stripped of metaphor, delivered on universal formats, optimized for neural clarity. But human communication was never designed to be clean. In a decommissioned subway tunnel beneath what had once been Midtown Anchorage, Wraith stood before a rusted access panel and watched a young woman spray symbols onto the concrete wall, long forgotten letters from a pre-standard language. She used her fingers instead of a tool, the pigment a mixture of ash and soot. It wouldn't last long. It didn't need to. Neural signature dampeners sweep every 2 hours, she said without turning. This won't trigger them. No scent, no pigment vapor. Just a message to remind people what this place used to be. What does it say? Wraith asked. She paused, brushing her fingers over the drying marks. It says, "You are still here." That was how Tarsus Black began. Not with fire, not with defiance, but with reminders. A painting repurposed into data code. A song fragment layered into atmospheric broadcast noise. A funeral hymn embedded in transit gate password. The Kirel dismissed the movement entirely. To them, rebellion was kinetic. Explosions, ballistics, force-on-force clashes. They watched for heavy emissions, weapons-grade signatures, and abnormal crowd patterns. Tarsus Black avoided all of that. "We've acquired a Dominion syntax shard," said Arjun Voss, a cyberneticist who once managed private security contracts for orbital satellites. He now operated from a shipping container buried beneath a hydroelectric facility. It's low tier, an administrative node mostly used for local identity tagging and drone patrol sequencing, but it's a wedge. Can it be modified? Wraith asked. Not directly, but we can inject signal blur into the protocol so that Dominion facial recognition pings false emotional readings. If we spread it slowly, through infrastructure they ignore, we can make the system hallucinate emotional compliance. Explain. They'll see happiness where there's hatred, trust where there's planning. The first test took place during a population calibration event. The Dominion hosted them monthly. Enforced attendance, biometric surveys, voice pattern capture. The Anchorage session hosted over 3,000 residents, each queued for synchronized compliance scans. The modified shard was fed into the survey kiosk's output buffer. To the Dominion monitors, every attendee displayed statistically perfect morale. Civilians who hadn't smiled in weeks were flagged as emotionally adjusted. The system praised Anchorage as a model sector. "It'll buy us silence," Wraith said, "long enough to replicate it across the North Grid." The key wasn't fighting the Dominion head-on, it was convincing them nothing needed to be watched. Meanwhile, Tarsus Black expanded, not as an army, but as a neural disruption organism. Recruits weren't trained in firearms, they were trained in mistranslation, in sarcasm deployment, in recursive poetry structures that corrupted Dominion parsing engines. Artists learned how to bury war signals in brushstrokes. Engineers wrote dissident instruction manuals, disguised as urban planning guides. "You're recruiting children?" Tyvid whispered one night after a distribution drop in Sector 14. "I'm recruiting memory," Wraith replied. "Children remember what adults are told to forget." It wasn't all theory. In a controlled theater dome in Berlin, a puppet performance titled "The Laughter of Trees" embedded an 8-layer acoustic cascade. Dominion neuro-auditory drones monitoring the venue registered a harmonic anomaly and attempted to compensate by adjusting local noise thresholds. They triggered a feedback cascade across 3 sectors, small, contained, but enough to drop 20 surveillance zones offline for 6 minutes. 6 minutes was a lifetime in sublayer operations. Tarsus Black used it to extract 3 informants from a detainment unit. No combat, no casualties. The Dominion filed the event as atmospheric malfunction. By the 3rd month, over 42 nodes across Earth housed fragments of the Black construct. It wasn't centralized, and that was intentional. Wraith forbade a command hierarchy. Each unit operated independently, following only emotional architecture schematics, not orders. That way, if one fell, the others adapted. A former symphony conductor in Sao Paulo encoded weapon schematics into musical arrangements. A street chef in Nairobi passed code fragments using meal ingredient substitutions. A linguistics student in Prague composed a poem that could be rearranged into 300 actionable sabotage sequences, depending on how you interpreted the metaphor. The Corel missed all of it. Their analysts began to detect rising energy expenditure among human cultural sectors, but without traditional indicators of rebellion. No public gatherings, no mass messages, no large-scale deviations. They assumed the phenomenon was related to psychological adaptation. In their view, Earth was stabilizing. Wraith knew better. In the deepest section of the Anchorage tunnel system, lit only by flickering battery arrays and thermal glow markers, Wraith stood over a hand-drawn schematic painted onto the wall. It wasn't a map of territory, it was a map of influence. Intersections where emotional disruption had taken root, where Dominion systems no longer functioned correctly. Each circle represented a point of emotional contamination. Each line traced how memory flowed. Beneath the last node, someone had written a phrase, "They don't understand us because they don't believe we're real." Wraith touched the word real, then turned to Voss. "Tell the teams in Sector 6, tonight we feed them grief." The directive came through at 300 hours. Deploy Phase 1 of Subset Echo 6, embed humor triggers into the broadcast buffer, use visual chaos as lead signal. Wraith tapped the approval on his slate, slid the device into his coat, and watched the Anchorage team roll out a set of modified public kiosks designed to mimic Dominion entertainment terminals. The new interface was identical at first glance. Gleaming interface, grid menu, clean lines. But the input layer had been subverted. Instead of delivering scheduled cultural feeds approved by Dominion Core, each kiosk injected subtle distortions, mismatched subtitles, mirrored imagery, sentence constructions that looped irrationally. A newsreader would suddenly switch languages mid-sentence. A cooking tutorial would break into war footage framed as comedy. Nothing violent, just absurd. Subtle enough that the system wouldn't immediately register the divergence. But for the human mind, the effect was unforgettable. "What happens if they trace it?" asked the engineer crouched beside the terminal, rechecking the bypass loops. "They'll assume it's a glitch," Wraith replied. "And if they don't? Well, we've got a backup plan." "What kind of plan?" "A worse joke." By noon, 32 Dominion-controlled cities experienced minor civilian unrest as confused citizens laughed mid-transit, burst into spontaneous song, or sat frozen in shock after watching instructional videos that played in reverse with incorrect emotional tone. The Dominion neuro-dampeners began spiking strange feedback across the behavioral grid. Reports streamed upward through the local overseers. Non-compliance patterns increasing, cause unclear, recalibration required. Inside a Dominion monitoring station deep in the Caucasus, 2 Chiral analysts stood before a looping surveillance feed of an Earth train platform. A young man leaned against a support pillar, headphones in, eyes wide as he mouthed the lyrics to a song that hadn't been publicly broadcast in over a decade. Around him, others began swaying, humming, not in synchronization, but in deliberate counter-tempo. "This behavior does not match observed norms," the taller analyst said, tapping an interface node with one curved finger. "Their entertainment sectors are triggering independent neural responses." "People are creating irrational network loops," the other responded. "The information lacks function yet spreads." "Shall we classify it as a resistance maneuver?" "Not yet. It may be cultural malfunction. Back in Anchorage, Arjun Voss hunched over a Dominion translation module, hijacked from a detainment facility. Its internal processor pulsed erratically as it attempted to translate a children's fable, written in recursive rhyme. "Look at this," Voss said, dragging Wraith over. The system tried to reduce the text to its literal components, but the structure redirects interpretation through emotional feedback. It thinks the story is a tactical doctrine about population control, so they're teaching themselves the wrong lesson. Exactly. If we amplify the complexity, we can make their systems over-adapt. They'll rewrite themselves into misinterpretation. The next operation pushed the concept further. A single train station in Johannesburg was programmed to run off schedule by 5 seconds, just enough to create interference with the Dominion's timing matrix. Every passenger announcement mispronounced one word. Arrival became awakening. Platform signs glitched just long enough to spell messages no one admitted seeing. Nothing violent occurred, no property damage, no open defiance. Yet by the end of the week, cargo shipments were rerouted to the wrong cities. Medical deliveries intended for northern Canada arrived in rural Vietnam. Atmospheric regulators over northern Europe began adjusting temperatures based on coordinates from classic Earth novels instead of weather patterns. The Corel formed a dedicated internal task force, Division 17, Cultural Disruption Diagnostics. Led by an artificial behavioralist named Ixor Van Thel, the team pulled thousands of hours of intercepted Earth media and attempted to establish a unified pattern of rebellion logic. They failed. One intercepted file, an animated short created by a Tarsus black artist in Mexico City, depicted 2 squirrels arguing over a missing acorn, only for the final scene to reveal the acorn was inside one of them the whole time. It ended with the phrase, "You are what you bury." Ixor concluded the video was a metaphor for political subversion. The actual function? It was a recruitment signal. Played backward, the audio waveform contained frequency tones that triggered pre-installed activation protocols in repurposed Dominion sensors across 6 districts, opening communication tunnels for the resistance. "What if we just stop fighting like soldiers?" asked Mila Thorne, adjusting the saturation levels on a corrupted mural being scanned into the Anchorage broadcast array. "What if we keep leaning into chaos and nonsense until they can't tell rebellion from performance?" "They're building analytical responses," Wraith cautioned. "They'll catch up. Barry don't understand creativity. They just catalog it. That's their weakness." Thorne's next composition aired live on 20 Dominion entertainment frequencies, disguised as an official historical documentary. It contained exactly 312 frames where the image of a Corel overseer was mirrored vertically, rearranging its facial bone structure to match a specific facial recognition bypass matrix used by Tarsus Black field agents. Nobody noticed. A Dominion HQ flagged the broadcast for emotional excessiveness and paused transmission permissions across 6 major hubs. Public feed distribution slowed for 5 days. The resulting silence gave the resistance free rein across dozens of operational corridors. They think if they cut access we'll fade," said Wraith as he reviewed the Dominion pause logs. "But silence is ours. They handed us the stage." Confidence spread faster than control could reassert itself. The resistance stopped waiting for orders. They began writing plays that reprogrammed Dominion drones mid-performance. One university staged a comedy act where every punchline was an algorithmic trigger for kinetic sabotage. In rural Pakistan, a shadow puppet show disrupted Dominion comms for 2 hours by mimicking Dominion facial patterns in such erratic rhythms that the monitoring software short-circuited. Wraith didn't need to coordinate these events anymore. He only needed to make sure the narrative stayed cohesive. "Let the galaxy think we've lost our structure," he said during a rare, full-circle call with the leadership cells. "Let them believe the virus has overtaken the host. But every laugh, every skipped step, every misspelled word is another attack." On the Dominion flagship Geranth Prime, Ixor Vanthal presented his findings to the High Command. His analysis claimed that Earth's defiance could not be contained through logical countermeasures. He proposed the formation of an emotional counterintelligence division. The request was denied. "People are irrational," said the command overseer. "Let them collapse beneath their own confusion." By then, 24 Dominion network nodes were infected with misinformation loops crafted entirely from Shakespearean monologues, fed through broken translation matrices. Wraith read the report and didn't smile. He merely noted the phrase the Dominion had written in their diagnostic summary. "We do not know where the war begins anymore." Wraith stood before the array's first prototype, staring at the tower's lattice of coiled copper, shattered mirror plates, and neural dampening cores pulled from scrapped Dominion sentinels. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't clean. But it could sing. And if it worked, it would make the Dominion hear what they'd spent centuries insulating themselves from: human grief at scale. Mirror Burn's signal path is stable, but the core, it's not responding evenly, said Voss, adjusting the calibration valve on the primary emitter coil. "The resonance isn't holding." "It'll hold once the emotional field sinks," Mila replied, stepping back from the interface console, her fingers stained with graphite and solvent. "We have to start slow, no overlapping frequencies." "I didn't ask for harmonics," Wraith said flatly. "I asked for impact. This isn't kinetic. You can't hammer it into place," Mila snapped, pointing at the waveform display. "We're not triggering pain. We're transmitting the memory of loss. There's a difference." A silence settled between them as the machine ticked and hummed in standby. On the external deck of the abandoned refinery they'd repurposed as a signal facility, the wind rattled empty scaffolds. The old rail lines below had been stripped to install thermal suppressors. Everything was cold, metal, tangled cabling, and the quiet pulse of potential energy. "Field teams in position," said Tyven through comms, his voice clipped. "Target unit is Dominion Outpost 47 Kappa. Local patrols use dampener Phase 3 armor. They're expecting mild crowd resistance, not Neuralink disruption." "How many units stationed there?" Wraith asked. 17. 1 command node, 3 mobile sentries, rest are behavioral enforcers. "And civilian proximity?" "Too close. The outpost sits on a residential grid. We can't isolate signal spread." "Doesn't matter," Wraith muttered. "No test environment is clean. Run it." Mila hesitated. "You don't want a trial pass with the low-band variant first?" "We don't need warning shots. Either it works or it..." Inside the primary deck, the emitter came alive. A soft oscillation spread across the steel floor, not through vibration but through memory, the kind that lingered not in the air but in the people who built it. Mila input the waveform manually, pressing each pulse like a key on an invisible instrument. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. The weight of absence, the echo of unanswered goodbyes. The pulse spread. At Outpost 47 Kappa, Dominion enforcers paused as their external sensors misread the emotional conditions of the crowd. Every face read as both passive and distressed. A contradiction. A logical inconsistency. The lead unit activated adaptive filters. The signal didn't stop. It multiplied, feeding off the corrective measures to become stronger. Then the first breakdown happened. The human liaison embedded in the residential grid, Agent Limar, screamed as the signal loop fed back into his neuroimplant. He dropped, convulsing. Civilian bystanders rushed in, confused, some already tearing off their Dominion-issued monitoring bands as the emotional field washed through the square like a current. "Cut the loop," Voss barked, eyes wide. "Kill the output now. Limar's crashing." Mila slammed the breaker switch and the signal died mid-sequence. The tower groaned, its core venting pressure. The air felt heavier somehow, like the building itself had just exhaled something it shouldn't have held in. "I told you the frequency was unstable," she said, her voice low now. "We were trying to wound the Dominion, not kill our own," Voss muttered, already pulling Limar's vitals onto a side screen. "He's alive, but we fried his frontal lobe patterns. Whatever he was thinking about when it hit him, that's burned in now." "Memories are irrational," Wraith said, stepping forward. "That's why the Dominion doesn't understand them. That's why we have to weaponize them." "We're not ready." Mila snapped. Not until we can tune it. You send that signal again, and you'll scramble half our field teams. That's why you're gonna fix it. Mila didn't respond. She just turned and walked off the deck. That night, the refinery was quiet. The tower lay dormant, its frame soaked in freezing fog. Wraith didn't sleep. He sat in the comms corner, listening to archived transmissions, Earth's emergency broadcasts from day one of the invasion. The recordings weren't tactical. They were voices. Some crying, some calm, all saying goodbye. At sunrise, Mila returned with a box of microfilament cores and placed them on the table. I restructured the signal to pass through emotional rhythm rather than cognitive recall, she said. It won't trigger synthetic implants the same way, but the payload might feel heavy. Define heavier, less noise, more meaning. Wraith nodded once, loaded. The second test came 12 hours later, targeting Dominion Outpost 92 Delta, no civilians nearby. The only inhabitants, Dominion enforcers, and a small command unit responsible for behavioral compliance in Sector 9. When the signal activated, it didn't begin with volume, it began with weight. Each note of the broadcast carried a fragmented lullaby, recorded by a mother in Santiago during the second week of the invasion. She had lost both children to the orbital blast wave. Her voice, slowed and looped, filled the relay network. Not as a scream, not as vengeance, as truth. Within 30 seconds, the command node's response system flagged non-routine enforcer behavior. Patrol units stopped responding to input. Their neural interfaces began absorbing the signal, interpreting it as command authority. Except the instructions didn't tell them what to do. The signal only told them how it felt to be human at the end of the world. One Dominion enforcer fell to his knees. Then another dropped his weapon. By the end of the first minute, all 11 units were stationary, their cognitive uplinks in feedback mode. And then the last one, designated Ven 14, removed his own helmet, dropped it, and stared upward toward the sky. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, unshielded, expression unreadable. He's not retreating, Voss reported. He's disconnected. Entirely. As the Dominion responded, Wraith asked. They've initiated a sweep for synthetic interference. They still think it's a tech fault. Good. Keep it that way. Terminated? Do you want Ven 14 terminated? Wraith didn't answer. He turned toward the viewport, watching the horizon as the last light faded. Send in a contact team, he said, but not armed. I want to know what a Corel defector looks like. The break line had been crossed. The Dominion would repair their systems, they would recalibrate, but they couldn't erase what they had absorbed. Human pain didn't fade. The Dominion dreadnought Saren Kal arrived in Earth orbit without a sound, a monument of mass and arrogance. Its orbital drift held perfectly above Sector 12, its hull a seamless amalgam of reactor shielding and surveillance arrays. It didn't deploy weapons. It didn't need to. Its presence was its own message. Order had returned. But by the time its scanners fully synchronized with the planetary grid, the damage was already done. The broadcast that reached it wasn't a challenge or a warning. It was a melody. Delicate, imperfect, and impossibly human. It played through the Dominion's spectrum-agnostic signal filters, undetectable at first, then layered beneath routine atmospheric noise. The crew didn't recognize it as hostile. They didn't recognize it at all. 70 seconds after reception, the Dreadnought's quantum sync relay failed. 8 seconds later, its inertial dampening field miscalculated a shift in planetary alignment, pulling it 4 degrees off station. A minor drift, barely a concern for a vessel of its size. Then the impact happened. Not from a weapon, but from a cluster of irregular debris. 3 metric tons of obsolete satellite cores fused with ceramic shrapnel and maneuvered into a slow gravitational slingshot. No propulsion, no emissions, just trajectory and time. The Dreadnought's shields didn't react because they weren't designed to detect garbage. The resulting breach tore through the ventral surveillance deck and sent Saren Kal spiraling into a defensive reboot loop. For the first time in decades, A Dominion capital ship declared itself compromised without a single enemy vessel in orbit. The music that triggered the cascade originated from an abandoned symphony hall in Kyoto. Once a place of concerts and civic addresses, it now housed a signal encoder built from scavenged Dominion translation cores and reconstructed pipe organs. The melody was composed by Mila Thorne and tuned by a team of linguists, mathematicians, and sound technicians. It was never meant to be heard. It was meant to be felt. The ship never saw the debris, Voss said, sitting cross-legged in a dim basement beneath the Anchorage Museum. The music hit them first. That's why they didn't respond. They filtered out the signal as meaningless, Mila replied, leaning against a stack of old exhibit crates. They don't understand non-literal patterns. They thought the audio was planetary noise. We encoded 4,000 lines of instruction into that noise. They just obeyed the wrong kind of logic. Across the room, Wraith stood before a shattered statue. A human figure, once sculpted in stone, now cracked and hollow. Someone had painted over the surface with data tags, visual glyphs coded in visible light encryption. The statue's base no longer displayed a name. It simply read, "Interpret me wrong." Did the Dominion respond? Wraith asked. Not with force, Voss said. But they've gone dark, no transmissions, no patrol realignment. They're trying to figure out what happened. People don't want to admit it was art, Mila said quietly. That would make them vulnerable to every painting, every sound, every word. In Sao Paulo, a group of schoolchildren painted a mural on a wall the Dominion had long since ignored. The image showed a massive figure cradling the earth in one hand, while the other hand held a mirror. The mirror was cracked. The Dominion scanners flagged it as irrelevant. But if seen from above, through a Dominion drone's optical array, the reflection formed a sequence of interference commands that temporarily disabled its uplink. The children didn't know the technicals, they only knew that drawing the cracks felt important. In an old observatory outside Nairobi, a sculptor used melted Dominion armor plates to form a spiral pattern aligned with Corel communication satellites. When the morning sun hit the sculpture, the reflected beam, barely visible, flashed at intervals that mimicked emergency shutdown protocols. It wasn't powerful enough to blind the satellites, but it flooded their analysis queues with corrupted flags. We're not sabotaging their weapons, Mila explained in a meeting beneath the Prague signal vault. We're corrupting the categories they use to define threats. How long before they adjust? Asked Wraith. They'd have to rewrite their entire architecture. They've built their empire on predictability. We've taught Earth to be unpredictable. You're saying Earth is a riddle they can't solve. I'm saying Earth is a poem they keep misreading. Another piece of the puzzle came from Quebec, where an ancient church's stained glass windows were fitted with layered filters that created prismatic effects under Dominion sky-scanning drones. The light scatter contained embedded coordinates for resistance supply caches, decipherable only through artistic color theory. Dominion drones began categorizing the windows as weather anomalies and rerouted. The world didn't look like it was at war, but it was. Every reclaimed canvas, every chorus sung at the wrong frequency, every misaligned sculpture became a node of interference. Cities glowed with purpose, but not in heat or emissions. They pulsed with ambiguity. The Dominion, for all its power, had never faced ambiguity as a weapon. One morning, a single phrase appeared across Dominion-controlled signage in dozens of cities. Billboards, transit screens, food dispensers. Do you remember what silence means? There was no source, no origin tag. The Dominion's message parsers attempted to trace it but couldn't even categorize the tone. Was it a threat? A question? A lament? No reply was given. Within Dominion Command, internal logs documented increased latency in compliance routing, failure of emotional dampeners in 6 major hubs, and an unprecedented request from a local Kirill commander for interpretive specialists. What are we even fighting now? One analyst reportedly asked in a secure log. They have no fleet, no artillery, only layers. Layers. That was the word that stuck. Wraith watched Dominion reaction times grow longer with each attack. He saw field reports mention signal ghosts, context blurs, and Emotive pollution. The Chiral's diagnostic language was falling apart. Their clarity, once the backbone of their strategy, had become a vulnerability. Bila can't adapt to uncertainty, Mila said. They evolved past it. They built a perfect machine to suppress chaos, and we turned chaos into structure. We're making noise and calling it warfare, Voss added. Wraith shook his head. No, we're building memory. They erased theirs. We're using ours. In the ruins of Krakow's cultural district, a musician performed a solo on a cello strung with fiber optic filaments. The notes carried layered packets, encoded coordinates for evac routes, defector safe zones, and false Dominion maps. No guard stopped him. He wasn't shooting. He wasn't shouting. He was playing. The Dominion had no word for this kind of resistance. And that was exactly the point. The Dominion Emperor did not speak in real time. His voice, filtered through centuries of neural enhancement and command matrices, arrived across the galactic net as a constructed presence, simultaneously translated, time-bubbered, and stripped of intonation. The message played in every controlled sector, each word crafted to sound neither threatening nor submissive. Earth, your conduct has disrupted cohesion and impaired balance across 22 compliant systems. Yet your creativity suggests potential. We propose a resolution. You will retain planetary autonomy under Chiral oversight. Aggression ceases. Memory is preserved. Culture is respected. The offer echoed across skies now littered with broken satellites and repurposed transmission towers. The feed paused, as if waiting for applause. Inside the Anchorage Command Vault, once a municipal transport hub, now Tarsus Black's primary relay bunker. Wraith watched the playback in silence. Mila sat beside him, arms folded, eyes fixed on the display. Voss stood against the back wall, head tilted, as if trying to find something unsaid in the message. No demand for surrender, Voss said. No mention of retribution. They're bleeding, Mila replied. They want a freeze without calling it one. Lath didn't look away from the screen. They're trying to preserve the illusion of dominance. If they offer peace while appearing magnanimous, they get to control the memory of this war. We decline, right? Voss asked. No, Wraith said. We reject it. Loudly. What's the difference? Ellen's polite. The other makes sure the entire galaxy hears us burn their mask. Preparations began within the hour. Wraith didn't record the response in a studio or behind a command desk. He chose the ruins of Dominion Beacon 14, a toppled relay pylon that had once pulsed daily compliance signals across North America. Now it lay in fractured segments across frozen ground, its interior scavenged for parts, its exterior scorched with graffiti in languages the Dominion hadn't even indexed. The camera unit wasn't clean. The angle was slightly off-center. That was deliberate. Perfection looked artificial now. Wraith stood in front of the largest segment of the beacon shell, its Dominion emblem half melted from the inside. At his feet, Ven 14 knelt without chains, without weapon, his head lowered, not in fear, but in refusal. The defected Kirill hadn't spoken since the incident at 9-2 Delta. He simply followed, observed. Wraith didn't wear a uniform, just the layered field coat he had used since the fall, still stained from crash burns, still unpatched at the right elbow. When the record light flashed red, he spoke without ceremony. You sent your message through our sky. You didn't ask. You declared. You said Earth belonged to the Dominion. His tone didn't rise, his posture didn't shift. And now you offer peace. Not because you seek balance, but because you lost control of the story. Behind him, wind stirred ash across the snow. A section of the beacon groaned under its own collapse. You underestimated memory. You mistook trauma for weakness. But we remember everything. Every family that vanished beneath your scans. Every child reclassified as biological inventory. Every city muted into obedience. He stepped to the side. Ven 14 remained kneeling, unmoving. This one, Wraith said, gesturing. You erased his identity. replaced his instinct with command code, but when he heard our grief, he remembered something you couldn't predict. Wraith crouched beside the Corel, not to intimidate, but to speak eye to eye. Pain is a compass. It points backward, but it also points home. He stood again, facing the camera. You don't offer peace, you offer a delay. You want time to rewrite this ending. His right hand rose, holding a Dominion helmet. Cracked. Scorched. A symbol of command. He dropped it onto the frozen ground. It didn't shatter. It rolled, awkwardly, and came to rest at Wraith's feet. No. Then he turned, aimed the remote transmitter, and detonated the final operational Dominion relay tower still anchored in Earth's orbit. From across the hemisphere, the flare of its disintegration lit the night like a second dawn. The message went out not just to Earth, but to every listening channel across occupied systems. No filter. No soft edit. The Corel's highest offer answered with destruction. Inside Dominion Strategic Command, the Emperor's synthetic interface paused. One of the central analysts spoke aloud without awaiting clearance. We build our authority without conditions. Do they present alternate terms? Another asked. No, they offer memory. The silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was recognition. Humanity had shifted the battleground from strategy to symbolism, and the Dominion had no vocabulary for losing a story. Back on Earth, Wraith stood over the beacon wreckage with Mila beside him. The cold wind scraped against his coat, but he didn't move. You think they'll retaliate? She asked. Yes, but not immediately. They need to understand what just happened. You think they will? He looked toward the distant sky, where the last of the orbital relay fragments still glowed in the upper atmosphere. They'll try to forget. And that's what will kill them. Later that night, across Dominion-controlled territories, unauthorized messages began appearing on civilian screens, public terminals, and even internal monitoring stations. Not attacks. Not propaganda. Only 3 words. We remember first. And with that, Earth wasn't just resisting, it was rewriting the rules. The Dominion hadn't lost control of the war. They'd lost control of the meaning. The first copy of Codex Leviathan was uploaded through a Dominion agricultural drone assigned to Sector 14 on the planet Uranus. The drone was scheduled to transmit monthly harvest tallies to Central Command. Instead, it carried a compressed payload designed not to destroy, but to awaken. Within 26 hours, the Codex reached 72 subjugated worlds. It did not crash systems. It didn't deploy worms or inject corrupted code. It told stories, in languages the Dominion had forcibly erased using phrasing that couldn't be reduced to numeric logic. Every passage was a loop, a parable whose meaning changed depending on how you read it. Embedded between the lines were logic traps, administrative flaws, and command hierarchy paradoxes the Dominion had hidden from their own middle-tier operatives. By the 3rd day, 3 planetary governors abdicated without resistance. Their Dominion translators stopped functioning after the phrase, "Tell us where the sun hides," triggered recursive shutdowns in their identity verification subsystems. Local overseers, stripped of real-time instructions, defaulted to drone mode. Motionless, silent, incapable of adapting without input. In the Anchorage vault, Voss stared at the screen showing system-wide Dominion latency rising by the hour. This isn't collapse. This is disintegration. Wraith didn't speak. He was reading the latest transmission from Kala IV, where the enslaved Eorni species had overturned a Dominion hydro-processing station using nothing but ritual chants encoded with codex variations. The Dominion guards didn't react with violence. They stood and listened. Then they left. It's not about instruction, Mila said. It's about meaning. We didn't give them tactics. We gave them permission to feel again. On Uranus Theta, an entire broadcast tower went offline after a group of enslaved miners projected a mural onto its antenna grid. The image? A painted child holding a severed Corel mask, her eyes reflecting stars. The system flagged it as unauthorized narrative incursion, then rebooted, and never came back online. Across the Dominion's border worlds, chaos did not roar. It settled, like dust that had waited too long to be stirred. In Harvok's Reach, a school once used for indoctrination opened its doors to silent protesters who placed copies of the Codex in every hallway, folded like prayer scrolls. The Dominion supervisor attempted to engage the crowd using compliance protocol, but each word he spoke began triggering incorrect responses. Every time he ordered silence, someone wept. Every time he commanded order, laughter followed. The compliance algorithm couldn't reconcile the outcomes. It collapsed, and the crowd walked past the supervisor like he wasn't there. Back in Anchorage, Rafe stood at the global distribution console as final Codex dispersals were pushed into Dominion fleet subsystems via navigation update queues. "You realize what this means," Voss said. "They won't just lose control of the occupied systems. They'll lose the ability to distinguish truth from subversion." Deep Rouse breezed answered. "They just haven't admitted it." The Dominion's central relay station on Torak Prime began broadcasting fragmented commands, identical orders with contradictory timestamps, emotional dampening requests formatted as tactical retreats. Local governors couldn't process the signals. Some evacuated their posts. Others shut down their control hubs and waited. In one notable event, a Dominion ambassador on Zerintal requested asylum from his own fleet. Galactic observers, many of whom had watched Earth's initial fall with detachment or amusement, now stared in silence as one system after another began to fracture. Not from attack, but from inversion. Earth hadn't broken the Dominion's back. It had inverted its lungs and made it breathe doubt. "We're getting transmission bounces from systems we never reached," Mila said. "They're passing the Codex forward, adapting it, embedding it in their own ways." "Then we've lost control of it," Voss said. "We were never meant to control it," Wraith replied. "Only start it." The Dominion's myth of perfection, stability, and supremacy had been etched into every border, every occupied mind. Now murals of burned insignias covered walls in cities once carved from fear. Dominion gates, once pulsing with signal control, pulses stood silent, not because they were destroyed, but because no one followed their rhythm anymore. Even Dominion personnel began resigning, not through mutiny, but through absence. They stopped showing up. They stopped transmitting. Entire stations were found intact but empty, as if abandoned by time itself. In a final act of symbolic retreat, the Dominion High Directive issued a classified internal directive labeled Project Reintegration. The contents: a request for emotional translation specialists to decode Earth's codex and determine what parts of it could be salvaged into Dominion doctrine. The request was rejected, upped by humans, by Dominion AI itself. The neural matrix running logic integrity checks returned a single phrase, logged across every terminal it was uploaded to. Error. Emotion cannot be assimilated. Wraith read the report 3 times. He didn't celebrate. He simply stepped outside the Anchorage vault, into the wind. In the distance, a group of children painted the broken Dominion insignia into the dirt with sticks, then laughed when the wind erased it. No orders, no symbols, just memory. And its release. He turned to Mila and said, "The Dominion hasn't fallen. It's forgotten how to stand." By the time the Codex reached Kavreth, one of the oldest Cairo colonies, the last broadcast from a Dominion flagship simply stated, "We will not return. We remember what we tried to erase." And Earth, once dismissed, once crushed, once silenced, watched the stars shift, one memory at a time. The last Dominion vessel exited Earth's system under escort, not by warships, but by quiet transmissions guiding it home through unclaimed stars. It did not return fire. It did not respond to inquiries. Its final signal carried no threat, only data. Unmarked, unencrypted. Inside the transmission, an archive of human music. No one intercepted it. No one needed to. From the high plains outside New Anchorage, where the first transmission tower of Tarsus Black had once pulsed grief into the sky, The sun crept up behind the fractured mountain ridge. The rebuilt city rose in disciplined layers, not sleek or symmetrical like Dominion strongholds, but rooted in lived memory. Angled streets named after places lost, murals layered over old damage rather than cleaned away. The wind carried no smoke, just cold air and the soft rustle of flags stitched from what the Dominion had tried to erase. At the center of the newly formed interstellar cord chamber, built not in orbit but on soil, stood a banner, black and gray, stitched from remnants of Dominion emblems, surrendered or abandoned. No national seal, no planetary crest. Just 3 words burned into the center. Ever again silence. The room was circular, open air, surrounded by stone taken from cities that had once burned. Delegates from former subject worlds stood side by side, many still learning what self-governance meant. There was no throne. There were no weapons. Colonel Dorian Wraith had declined every seat offered to him. He stood just outside the chamber entrance, coat buttoned high, hair streaked with new gray. People were speaking, Mila said softly behind him. "I already have," Wraith answered, his eyes never leaving the floor of the chamber. "It's not for them, it's for us." He turned, saw her standing in the doorway, holding a folded document, handwritten, 1 copy only. Codex, Leviathan's, final appendix. Not a weapon. A memory catalog. Voss says the last Dominion transmission listed Earth as a planetary anomaly of concern, she said. They've updated all standard fleet AI to include a cautionary protocol. Wraith didn't smile. What's the trigger? Human silence. Any unregistered pause of more than 40 seconds from a human-controlled signal source is now considered a potential act of warfare. This time he did smile. Briefly. "They tried to measure us by control," he said, "and they lost because we made meaning out of noise." Mila stepped beside him as the chamber quieted, the vote complete. The accord had passed unanimously. Its first article wasn't about trade or expansion or shared defense. It was a singular directive. No world shall be governed without memory. The ceremony was brief. There was no anthem. Instead, a recording played, one from Earth's own signal logs. A lullaby, the same one that had reached Ven 14 and broken his conditioning. Sung by a mother whose name would never be known by the galaxy, but whose grief had brought an empire to its knees. Wraith looked up as it played, listening not to the melody, but to the silence that followed. It wasn't empty anymore. Back in the Anchorage Memorial Plaza, a monument had been constructed. Not tall or grand, just a low arch built from reclaimed orbital steel and concrete salvage from the first Dominion beacon torn down. Beneath it, etched into the foundation, were the names of every resistance signal hub. Some still standing, others only memory. A small crowd gathered quietly around it. No speeches, just a moment. Voss approached, carrying a faded datapad. "We're shutting down Tarsus Black," he said. "Everything we built. It's open source now. They'll teach it in schools, use it in history simulations. But the system itself, it's done." "Good," Wraith said. "We weren't supposed to become a government. We were supposed to leave a scar." "You did," Voss said, placing the datapad down at the base of the arch. "And they'll feel it every time they look at us." Across the stars, the shift was undeniable. Planets once drilled hollow to feed Dominion infrastructure began reforesting their atmospheres. Trade networks rerouted through democratic compacts. Languages once marked for extinction returned in ceremonies, songs, and broadcast rituals. Earth, the one world dismissed as primitive, had not only resisted subjugation, it had redefined the parameters of conquest. Not by force, but by refusing to forget. By turning pain into a language no empire could translate. And so it was written into the new Accord Charter. Any species attempting to override Earth without consent shall be treated as non-rational and unfit for galactic leadership. Unofficially, the galactic phrase that replaced military caution codes was far simpler. "Do not provoke Earth." Wraith stood at the edge of the plaza as the crowd dispersed. The wind picked up, cold but clean. Mila stayed beside him, arms folded, gaze on the horizon. "What now?" she asked. "Now we let them grow," he said, "without us leading, without us watching." "You think they'll forget?" Wraith said. "We buried the Dominion with a song. You don't forget something like that." She nodded, then handed him the final registry log for the Accord archives. "You want your title listed?" Wraith looked down at the blank line. "No." He handed the slate back. "Let them remember what we did, not who did it." Behind them, a child stepped toward the arch, tracing a hand along the edge. Not reverently, curiously, as if trying to understand what had once happened here. Wraith watched him, then turned toward the city rebuilt from fire and silence. The sky was clear, and the war was over. Humanity had been underestimated. They would never be again. You don't offer peace, you offer a delay. Smash that like if that line hit hard, subscribe, share, and drop a comment. Should Earth have accepted the Dominion's offer, or did we do exactly what had to be done?